Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This is actually the second part of a two-part lecture dealing with forgetting. There is unfortunately a lot to remember about forgetting. Ha ha, bad joke. So, in the first lecture I covered memory decay and I covered interference. And particularly interference is probably a big one in terms of the way that we forget. Now, what I'm going to cover in this lecture are some smaller ones that, well, in some cases may or may not exist, but in other ways they're simply not necessarily a huge deal. We don't think about them, we don't worry about them, they just kind of happen, and if you know they're happening, you might be able to fix them, but otherwise, who knows. So, more ways that we forget, other than memory decay and interference. Now, the first type is called encoding failure. And like the rest of these that you're going to see here, it's pretty much named exactly what it is. Encoding failure is when you fail to encode. Remember, encoding is the first stage of getting information into memory. You encode it, you store it, you retrieve it. And of course, if you don't encode it, it never got into storage in the first place. And arguably, if it never got into storage in the first place, you never learned it. You never memorized it. So therefore, if you don't remember it, it's not technically forgetting. Forgetting by definition is not being able to remember something you actually learned. It's why encoding failure is also sometimes called pseudo-forgetting. Pseudo meaning fake. It's not real forgetting, it's fake forgetting. And unfortunately, a lot of times when my students cannot remember information on a test, I don't think it's interference or memory decay or the other forms of forgetting. In a lot of cases, I think they simply never learned them in the first place. They used maintenance rehearsal, but it never got into their long-term storage. And so therefore, technically, they didn't forget it because they never learned it in the first place. Now, retrieval failure is also named exactly what it is. And this is when you have actually learned something, you have actually put it into storage, but you cannot retrieve it. The memory is probably there somewhere in your brain, but you simply cannot find it. Now, if encoding failure is arguably an example of proactive interference, or can be, retrieval failure can very well be an example of retroactive interference. There's something blocking you from retrieving that number. Remember when I told you back in the other lecture about that old phone number that I couldn't remember until I looked it up? Well, as soon as I looked it up in that old resume, I more or less smacked my forehead and said, of course that's it! Of course that's the number! It wasn't that phone number, when it got taken out of the phone number slot in my brain, had been thrown out. It had been filed someplace else. And until I got the correct retrieval cue to find it, which in this case was the actual number itself, I couldn't remember it. I sometimes think of retrieval failure as what happens in libraries sometimes, when library patrons reshelve their own books. There's a reason that libraries tell you not to do that, and that's because if you take a library book and you put it in the wrong place, it could be lost for years. You may have run into this. You need to get a particular book out of the library, whether for fun or for work. And you go there and you look it up in the computer, and the computer says it's in the library, and you say yes, and you go to the spot on the shelves where the computer says the book should be, and it's not there. And you look around, and it's not there. And you may go ask a librarian. The librarian will probably come and look to make sure it's actually not there. And then they will probably look on their computer, and they will say, well, the computer says it's here, but it's not on the shelf, and it's not in the back being processed, so I don't know where it is. It's somewhere in the library, odds are, but if it's misfiled, you can't find it. And in fact, a lot of libraries, every couple of years, will shut down completely for a few days, whereupon people will make sure that every single book is where it's supposed to be. They'll go through every single book to make sure it's in the right place and try to find those books that had been misshelved, that had been quote-unquote lost, and put them back where they were. It's quite possible the same is true with memories. That when a memory suddenly pops back to you, it's because you found the correct retrieval cue to bring it up. And the fact that this can happen, and does happen quite a bit, also kind of argues against memory decay as a form of forgetting. Because if we actually lost these memories, if they faded, it wouldn't matter what retrieval cue you had. It's gone. It's like if someone walked out with the book. Doesn't matter where you look on the shelf, the book isn't going to be there. But in an awful lot of cases, the memory is there. It's just that we sort of forgot where we put it. Intentional forgetting. Now, these last three, it's interesting because sometimes I think psychologists simply name things somewhat arbitrarily. So I've decided that I am going to separate these and give them very precise definitions, which may or may not agree with what other psychologists say, but it'll give you a good idea, I think, of what's going on and generally what these seem to mean. I use the term intentional forgetting for when we forget things that simply are not important, that are inconsequential, that are not things we need to remember. An example of this might be what clothing you wear on a particular day. Do you remember what clothing you wore last July 23rd? Of course you don't, unless it was your birthday or some big event. You don't remember. I don't remember what clothing I wore 3 days ago. Okay? I don't remember what I had for lunch 3 days ago. Now, that same day, I could tell you what I had for lunch today. I could tell you the clothing I wore today. I might even be able to tell you the clothing I wore yesterday. Actually, maybe not. I just tried to remember it. I couldn't remember. But, you remember things sort of when they happen. It appears that when we are asleep at night, among the other things that happen during sleep, our brains decide what memories to keep and what memories to get rid of. There's some suggestion that that's what dreaming is for. And it's why we tend to dream about things we've thought about or experienced, or movies we've seen or books we've read. But it appears that when we're asleep that our brain decides what memories to keep and what to get rid of. So it's possible that at some point during the night your brain is, going through these memories. Okay, what did I have for lunch? Not important. Throw it in the trash. What did I wear clothes? Not important. Throw it in the trash. And then do the physiological sort of equivalent of emptying the bin. Okay, throwing out the trash. So that you lose those memories. And this could be anything really that isn't very important. Imagine the problem you would have if you remembered absolutely everything. There are people that do this, by the way. There are people with amazing memories that can tell you what they were wearing on July 23rd. They could tell you what they were wearing on July 23rd, 1983, assuming they were alive at the time. They could tell you what they did and what they wore and what they had for lunch, but that particular ability is extremely rare. And quite frankly, that's probably a good thing because we don't really need to remember all that stuff. Think about it. If you drive a car, imagine if you remembered every single parking spot you'd ever had in your entire life. If you go to school 5 days a week and you park someplace different every single day, at the end of the semester, your mind would be seething with what? 100 different parking spots, and you would never remember where you parked. So instead, things that aren't important, we get rid of. Intentional forgetting. Now, suppression is a little different. Suppression is when we consciously and deliberately try to forget something. Intentional forgetting just happens. You don't have to say to yourself, I'm not going to remember what I had for lunch. But suppression is when, for instance, you do something that is just bone stupid, or you do something that's embarrassing, or you do something that you really, really wish you hadn't done. And you say to yourself, well, I'm just not going to remember this. That would be suppression. I'm not going to remember it. I'm not going to think about it. It is simply not going to cross my mind ever again. I'm going to purge it from my memory. You might have tried to do this at some point. I joke I did that with my freshman year in college, the calculus class that I took. I was like, I'm not going to remember this. This was not a good experience. I'm going to forget it. But if you have tried to do that, you probably know that suppression doesn't work particularly well. And in fact, when we try very hard to forget something, very often, it simply causes us to remember it even more than we might otherwise do. So, yeah, intentional forgetting is for little tiny minor things. Suppression is for when we consciously and deliberately try to forget things and it doesn't work very well. And now we get to the really strange one, which is repression. Now, repression was first devised by Sigmund Freud. And I gotta tell you, that every time someone says Sigmund Freud, you should very thoughtfully kind of look up into air and go, Because a lot of what Freud made up, and I use the word made up deliberately, okay? A lot of what he made up has virtually no basis in scientific fact. Freud was someone to never let, the real world get in the way of a good idea. And it's possible that repression is one of those things. Repressed memories If you've ever heard of someone talk about recovered memories, that when they were a child or something so horrible happened to them that they simply blocked it out. Okay. And then later on, since they didn't actually forget it, they just prevented themselves from consciously thinking about it. When they would begin to have problems, they would have to recover that memory. The big thing about recovered memory these days is probably recovered memories of sexual abuse, of child sexual abuse. The idea is that when very young children are sexually abused, what they might do, since they simply cannot handle this, and you can't blame them, they cannot handle this, that they will simply repress the memory. So they will have no conscious awareness that this actually happened. If you ask them, they won't know. And they're not lying. They don't remember it because their mind basically took over and repressed it and prevented them from being able to remember it. And the idea then was when you repress memories, that even though you don't remember them, and this is the idea behind recovered memories as well, that even if you don't remember it, it can still affect you because you've buried it metaphorically, in the basement of your mind. But if you've ever seen horror movies where they bury things in basements, they never stay there, do they? I mean, those things that get buried always come back to haunt you, usually literally. And Freud believed that memories that we repress could do the same thing. And that if a person is unhappy or having problems, it might be because of these repressed memories. And part of Freudian therapy and part of the idea behind recovered memories is that we need to go and dig those up and deal with them so they don't bother the person anymore. The big problem with recovered memories is twofold. Well, it's probably more than that, actually. For instance, it appears that certain psychologists are always finding recovered repressed memories while other psychologists never ever find them in a million years. And that kind of makes you wonder whether or not those psychologists are deliberately looking for them, and that when they look for something hard enough, you'll find it even if it isn't actually there. It's sort of the experimenter effect. We see what we expect to see. And it doesn't help that certain proponents of recovered memories have said things like, and this is a pretty close to direct quote, "If you have no memory of being sexually abused as a child, that may be evidence that you were." Go ahead and rewind that and listen to me say that again. The mind boggles. It really doesn't help. And also remember just how easily memories are changed. Back when I talked about reconstruction or reconstructive processing, there's been a lot of research on how eyewitness memories can change simply by what questions a person is being asked. And it's also possible that's what's happening is that these particular therapists are asking questions in such a way to cause the person to reconstruct a memory, not a reconstruct, a constructive memory of something that never happened. The problem, of course, being that even whether or not that memory is constructed or reconstructed, now the person has memories of these horrible things happening to them and they should probably get some therapy. Because those reconstructed memories feel just as real. Even if they're pseudo-memories, they feel just as real memories. And the person now is going to have to deal with that. And I'm not saying that therapists are going, I'm going to screw with their mind and give them memories of something that never happened. The therapists are thinking that they're doing a good thing. It's just that the technique they're using may not be doing what they think it does. The idea of repression, the idea of recovered memories is that is still, it's the source of huge debate in the psychological community. So when you hear people talk about recovered memories or repression, and they're talking about it like it's a done deal and an established fact, it simply is not. And so it's just a very, very dicey topic. And I also, I don't know if I need to remind people of this, but when people have undergone terrible experiences, whether as a child or as an adult, generally their hardest problem is not remembering the event, it's forgetting it.